you've sort of pick out the words that kind of tell you something about the Australian psyche.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Can you tell the story of a nation through just 100 words? And if you can, what do those words reveal and perhaps conceal about who we are? Well, since 1788, most Australians have spoken English. In fact, over 70% of us only speak it at home today. And almost as soon as the convicts disembarked from the First Fleet, the English they spoke began to diverge from their mother tongue, British English. After all, it was hardly the English countryside they were describing when they looked around what was to become Sydney, let alone the animals they saw. Although they certainly tried to reuse familiar names, it's hard to imagine a football team invoking the ferocity of an English magpie. And what do you call a kangaroo when you've never seen one before? Well, what emerges over time is something more than slang, it's identity. The language that evolved soon became the perfect embodiment of Australia's emergent egalitarian culture. We may have been ochre larrikins who had no time for bludgers and wowsers, but we were fair dinkum, true blue, and would defend our mates if they got in a stoush. Well, to discuss Australia in just 100 words is historian and lexicographer Amanda Laugesen, who's director of the National Dictionary Centre at the ANU. Amanda spent her career tracing the evolution of Australian English and distills centuries of history from megafauna to democracy sausages into the language that has shaped and been shaped by our Australian experience. Amanda, welcome for a second time to Afternoon Light.
Thank you so much, Georgina.
It's great to have you on Afternoon Light. Your previous appearance was on Australian accents, and what a plethora of accents we have. It's a very interesting topic and from where they came. Linked to this, of course, is the words we use in Australia. And as I was reading your book and thinking about this, I realised, having been born in the UK, my mother is English and most of her family still live in the UK. We do speak quite different languages, don't we?
Yeah.
From the English, at least.
Yes, that's right. Well, I think all the varieties of English, as they've sort of evolved across the period of British colonialism, has taken on their own distinct cast. I think one of the really interesting things about Australian English, though, is the extent to which it's very much bound up with our identity and the way in which we think about ourselves. If you think about American English, Americans tend to think that their version of English is kind of the correct one, I guess, and they're perhaps a little less aware of the nuances between the different varieties of English. But there's not really a sense that that's part of their core idea of their identity. Whereas for us, I think we're very attached to our creative language and our use of English as an expression of our values and our identity and our character.
And it certainly is just that, reading your book. It reminds me about how distinct we are and how our identity has changed throughout our history too, which I found really interesting. But look, you've chosen to write a book, Australia in 100 Words. Where did the idea for this book come from? Look, let's be honest, it's very clickbaity. You definitely click on, what are the 100 words? And it will be great dinner party, debate, conversation, fodder.
Yeah, so the way it evolved was I'd already done a previous book on the history of Australian swearing with New South Publishers, and they approached me to do another book around words, and, quirky words was kind of the pitch. And I thought, I'm not really sure. I just want to talk about quirky words. It's not that interesting. But one of my colleagues, when we had our 25th anniversary of the Australian National Dictionary Centre, we thought about doing a little booklet that would basically be 25 words that were the exemplars of Australian English. Anyway, that kind of sparked an idea that I thought it would be really interesting to look at Australia through picking out 100 words that would tell the story of Australia. And initially it was kind of going to be a thematic, various chapters based on themes, sport or war or what have you. But actually, as I started working on it, and that was actually how I pitched it to the publisher, but I realised that kind of doing that chronological sweep would be more interesting and not sort of bore the pants off people by just having a whole lot of words around one particular semantic theme. So that was really how it developed as a project that I was able to get published. But I think part of the reason around thinking about Australia in 100 words was really saying, okay, well, let's take a look at Australian English. People are always interested in words. They really, kind of connect to that idea of particular words and the story of particular words, and use that to tell a history of Australia as it's evolved across time.
Yeah. And no doubt when you are limiting yourself to 100 words, 25 words, there are lots of words you left out. How difficult was it to just land on those 100 words? Was it that sort of that 101st word you just agonised over? Is it in? Is it out?
Yeah, actually, that's really interesting because I think I got to I had a very long list to begin with. So I went through, the basis of the book was our Australian National Dictionary, the Australian words and their origins, our big dictionary. I went through that and I sort of had a long list that I pulled out of there, and then I kind of worked on a short list. And it was difficult to select what were the themes or what were the sort of historical episodes that I really wanted to bring into the story. In some cases, you could have one word, but then there would be lots of kind of synonyms or related words that I could put into those little chapters. But I think when I got to the final one and I've eliminated a whole bunch of things, I got to about 98 and I was like, well, what are my last ones going to be? And I think I had sort of categories that I hadn't yet put in insects. And I was like, should I pick an insect? I was sort of polling people going around. What do you think?
Like a mozzie.
Yeah, should I have an insect or should I have a this or should I have a that? And so I was trying to think of what kind of categories. And I think nobody actually came back to me after the book came out to say, why were there any insects? But one thing that I did think about was putting in kind of like greetings, like I'm saying g'day and those kinds of expressions. But I just thought, I don't really know what I want to say about that. But that's the one thing that people have said, why didn't you put in g'day and and terms like that. So, yeah.
Well, it is just 100 words and you are a historian too. So telling the story of Australia through words and a select group of words, you are going to limit it to certain types of words, I'm sure. Now, the word Australia, of course, is a relatively modern word in the great span of a continent's history. So you've taken a very broad approach when you titled your book Australia in 100 Words. You started way, way, way in ancient sort of Jurassic history, haven't you, with dinosaurs and megafauna. Why did you start then rather than in the sort of more familiar, I guess, contemporary or post-white settlement history?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to really think about our continent as something that's kind of beyond human settlement. So I was quite influenced at the time reading a lot about climate change and thinking about the origins of the continent. I had initially thought about maybe beginning it with, as I do, with deep time and ending it with Anthropocene, but nobody liked Anthropocene. So that one got jettisoned. But to really say that, okay, well, we've got this Australian English that really represents the kind of human occupation of the continent, including, of course, words from Indigenous languages as well and Indigenous ways of seeing the continent, but also put it into this broader perspective that's beyond, just human occupation. And also I like megafauna and dinosaurs, so I quite enjoyed researching more about that. I'm certainly no scientist, but I found all of that really interesting. And I think we have so many sort of fossils that have been sort of preserved here in Australia on the continent that it's a really interesting part of our story.
It is. And I was intrigued by is it the Minmi?
The Minmi.
Which was a small ankylosaur. I'm going to really, really mash up the pronunciation here. Walking on 4 legs, had a long tail and a short neck and covered in bony armour. So it's sort of like an armadillo. It was about 2 meters long and 1 meter high. So it's like a giant armadillo.
Yeah, there's so many interesting, like I said, I'm no scientist and no expert on this, and I've probably forgotten things from even when I put them into the book because I don't kind of retain that information necessarily. But there are so many interesting dinosaur and megafauna fossils in Australia, and it's really interesting to investigate them. One of our most recent things, not in this book, but that we've been looking at for putting into the Australian National Dictionary is the drop croc. I don't know if you've come across this, but this is
I have not.
A megafauna, but it's an ancient, I think maybe 50,000 years ago, crocodile type thing, would climb the trees to hunt. And so the sort of informal name for this is the drop croc. So it could, like a drop bear, drop down on its unsuspecting prey, which sounds slightly terrifying.
On a tangent here, but your Australian National Dictionary Centre releases a word of the year every year. And I was looking at your words just before we started recording, and I actually thought sometimes I've never heard of these words. So I don't know whether I live in some sort of vacuum or I'd never heard of a stroll out. And I'd never heard of Colesworth, which were stroll out being your 2021 word and Colesworth was your 24 word. When I read the descriptions, I thought, oh, of course, they make sense. But it's interesting choosing these words. Not all these words will be very familiar is, I guess, the point. And indeed, the 100 words you've chosen in your book are not all instantly recognisable for us, are they?
Yes, that's right. I mean, one of the things we do with our Word of the Year is to look at Australian things, some years richer than others in terms of like the uniquely Australian terms that come to the fore.
Yeah, ISO perhaps wasn't so unique to Australia. ISO it was perhaps a shared global experience.
Nothing but sort of COVID-related things for a couple of years there. Well, we don't need to go back there. But yeah, I mean, one of the goals I had, I guess, with the book and what I was thinking about as I was selecting words was really saying, okay, well, I want to have some things that people are going to be really familiar with. You know, you've got to have your larrikins and your bogans and these kinds of characters and digger and so forth, but also to have things that were less familiar and to both just sort of illuminate various aspects of our past that have now been forgotten, but also to talk about how Australian English is this much broader thing. It's not just slang or it's not just those kind of iconic Aussie figures like the digger and the larrikin. There's actually made up of a lot more. So hopefully I was able to do something at that to kind of say, okay, actually Australian English is this much broader thing.
And one of the really interesting things I learned is how many names, particularly of animals or words, are derived from Indigenous languages. I mean, I live in a road called Kooyong, which is Indigenous. I used to live in a suburb called Paran, which is Indigenous. So, there are lots of words in our everyday language that have Indigenous derivations. But it must have been really interesting to research that first contact the white settlers had with the Indigenous people and how they were learning to name all the sights and sounds, the flora and the fauna. And, it was just overwhelming quantities of these things. They had to really look to what the Indigenous people around Australia were calling them to name them all, I guess.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think one of the important parts of the story of Australian English is, of course, its relationship to Indigenous languages and the number of words that have been borrowed in from Indigenous languages. And the other aspect of Australian English that's really an important part of its story is the vast amount of flora and fauna that actually makes up our unique vocabulary. And a lot of that is borrowed from Aboriginal languages. So, yes, it was very much about the settlers kind of saying, well, what is that? And getting those names. And also a lot of the descriptive accounts that were written in the 19th century that would write the Indigenous names for particularly the environment, plants and animals, and then those words coming into English across time as well. So sometimes early on in that process of contact and then sometimes later as well. So there were many different ways in which the word kookaburra, which I think was googaburra in its original language, but there were lots of different ways in which it was written in the 19th century. I mean, it's really interesting, the whole variant spellings, pronunciations, shortened forms. But by the time you get later in the 19th century, that kind of largely settled on kookaburra being the form in English. But it gives you that idea. I think it's really important to acknowledge that relationship to First Nations languages in our Australian English story.
And I guess in maybe somewhat desperation, the early settlers sometimes just said things were a native cat, a wild turkey, wild spinach, or I love the echidna being called just a native hedgehog.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the other sort of flip side of that in a way. Like on the one hand, is at least some kind of intention to try and understand how the Indigenous people saw the environment. On the other hand, it's like, well, let's just compare this to something we're already familiar with. I mean, there's a whole plethora of those kinds of names.
But kangaroo, they really couldn't. They really couldn't come up with something similar.
So, using that kind of native and wild and native as the descriptors that they would apply to these things. Some of those names, of course, haven't been sort of retained in our Australian English, but you can see the great variance. And also just not having settled on a name for a particular thing. So you see a whole bunch of different terms being used.
Yeah. What about the words that Indigenous Australians used to describe the white settlers? Because that was interesting of course, that they would have been discussing it, and it was, for some a great trauma, a great shock. So that is reflected in your book as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I include the word Balander as one of my 100 words, which was a word that was used in Northern Australia for non-Indigenous people. But there are a whole number of words that were being used by Indigenous people. Some of the other ones include Luhan being used in the Gippsland area and Dagay from Bundjalung. What I wanted to do there, I guess, was, we're pretty familiar, I think, with the kind of language that Europeans use to describe Indigenous people. I think we know, I wanted to avoid falling back on those kinds of racial and racist epithets that were used and language that was used to describe Indigenous people, and to sort of turn it around and actually say, how did the Indigenous people describe these Europeans that were coming in? Balander is also interesting from the point of view that it was used in Northern Australia, but it came through Malay. So it was actually from the contact with Malay people who were coming down to engage in trade in the north of Australia. So it kind of connected the Australian story also to the world to the north of us. So not just thinking about the British coming, but also thinking about those other relationships that we had on the continent even before 1788.
What I think is interesting as well in your book is, so we're talking about Australian English, but there's also Aboriginal English, which has its own distinct words and characteristics. So, deadly, white fella are two familiar names. And I guess the converse is black fella for the white people describing the Aboriginal people. How did that develop, and is that something you found really sort of rich in, I guess, the evolution of Aboriginal identity side by side the British Australians who were getting used to this very, very new and foreign land?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much wonderful research that's being done into, I think now it's more common to sort of talk about Aboriginal Englishes, because there's a variety of them around the continent, and they've developed in quite different ways, say in the north of Australia than they have in the southeastern part of Australia, for example. It's not explicitly my area of expertise, and I certainly defer to people who have done a lot more work on Aboriginal Englishes. I certainly wanted to acknowledge both Aboriginal Englishes as well as Indigenous languages in this book, insofar as I'm not an Indigenous person and I want to show respect to those languages. And I think also important to kind of remember them as a number of those languages. Many of those languages are no longer, Aboriginal Englishes are, but many Indigenous languages are, of course, now sleeping languages. But to recognise them as being part of our broader language ecology. What I think is interesting is that we might be seeing a few of those Aboriginal English terms coming into broader Australian English. You mentioned deadly is probably the best known and most prominent of those terms. There's a few in WA as well, where we've seen, I think, the term darty, which means sort of sexy or attractive, is a term that's quite popular there. It's come out of Aboriginal English and into more mainstream use by non-Indigenous people. So I think that's also interesting to think about, as sort of the relationship between these different languages in Australia, and reminding us, yes, we all speak English. I think you mentioned that statistic about how most of us only speak English at home, but that there is this kind of broader language ecology in Australia.
And it's so fast moving. I am a parent of two teenagers, and every day I think, no, I really have no idea what that word means. That's a new one. So it's just constantly evolving. Now, you write in your book about pure merino, and perhaps I'm betraying my huge ignorance. I'd never heard of pure merino or merino, aside from the context of sheep, of course. But can you tell me, what did it mean to be a pure merino?
Yeah, so the term pure merino, obviously merino sheep were one of the first excellent breeds of sheep here in Australia, brought in quite early, I think maybe the 1820s, 1830s, I'm not quite sure about the dates. But the term, very early in Australian settlement, in the convict colonies, the distinction between those who were free settlers and those who came not free became pretty quickly a kind of social distinction as well. So pure merino was a term that was used for those who came as free settlers. So in particular for those who were squatters, owned large tracts of land, were the ones who were out there with the sheep creating the pastoral settlement of Australia. And it continued on very much really meaning people who didn't have convict ancestry. And so it was kind of used as a mark of social status or social distinction, which that kind of distinction was still quite prestigious until, sometime in the 20th century where suddenly having convict ancestry became the
so
thing.
You have a bit of cachet. Yeah, people are quite proud of it. Yeah, it's interesting how things can change so dramatically. Of course, our convict past is incredibly important to our national story, to our national identity. But how much of the convict, community was driving the divergence from British English, the sort of motherland English, and what becomes Australian English?
Yeah, certainly that we identified a lot of distinctive or unique Australian terms through the early decades of settlement, much of which is linked to that convict system. So if you think of things like tickets of leave or assigned servants or female factory or those kinds of terms that were intimately linked to the convict system. But of course, they have no traction beyond that because once that system is gone, once people are no longer convicts, and we don't really need that language anymore. So certainly we see a big vocabulary coming in, but not being really retained in Australian English, whereas a lot of the words that developed through the middle of the 19th century that are linked to farming and migration and settlers coming in and the growth of the colonies tend to be the ones that really get retained in Australian English. So, yeah, I would say that much of the vocabulary of the convict period, so there's on the one hand the kind of convict system language, on the other hand the kind of flash language that comes with the convicts themselves. So the slang that they use, that they bring from the streets of the cities of the UK out to a much different place. Some of them have value, some of them don't. Some of them pretty quickly don't really have much value when you don't have much by way of city or settlement. But a few of those terms have retained. We first see swag being used in that flash language, and of course it's retained with a different meaning later in Australian English. The term gammon, meaning deceit in the flash language, interestingly enough, goes into Aboriginal English and is retained in Aboriginal English, meaning essentially BS, a sort of variant of guile and deceit. So there is a little bit of that trickling through, but a lot of it is very much of that convict period and that distinctive experience.
Something I'm interested in is the word larrikin, which these days means someone who's happy-go-lucky, a bit naughty, a bit cheeky, talks a lot, bit, a character. But it had a very, very different meaning originally, didn't it?
It did, yeah. So essentially larrikins were the youth gangs, urban gangs of the 19th century. And much like today when we worry about things like gangs, back then there was kind of moral panic about larrikins and what they were doing. You couldn't walk on the streets because the larrikins were going to give you a hard time. So that was very much a kind of subculture, if you like, of young people, especially urban young people who may have struggled to get work, may have had sort of limited socioeconomic opportunities, I guess we'd call it these days, who kind of created a subculture that was quite distinctive, had a distinctive dress, so they tended to dress in very flashy ways, distinctive kind of language and way of behaving and performing. And then though there's sometime around the time of the First World War, we see that term really begin to shift in meaning. And it seems that the war itself helped that transition from thinking about larrikin as a kind of scary person to a larrikin as a positive person, because the diggers themselves used the term larrikin. You had people coming from the cities who enlisted, went and fought. They then became the kind of heroes, right? They became the jokesters, the jokey digger. They retained the sort of anti-authority, I guess. So that's a kind of through line, the defying authority, causing a bit of trouble. So we know that of our First World War diggers. But it started to become a much more positive thing through that period of the war and then in the post-war period. And now it's sort of lost all of that kind of negative connotation and really become a term. I don't know if everyone would like to be called a larrikin. I know, we tend to see it as a fairly positive thing.
Yeah. And I guess the antithesis of larrikin is wowser, which is also an Australian term.
Yeah, so the wowser, and I mean, I think one of the fun things about the term wowser is, of course, where it came from, the term itself. So the wowser was the kind of puritanical killjoy, as compared to the larrikin, which tends to be said of men. Wowser tended in the past, perhaps not so much anymore, but certainly around the time of the late 19th, early 20th century, a wowser was usually a woman and was linked to the temperance movement, which was very strong through that period, the condemnation of drinking alcohol, which was very much part of Australian culture. And the term itself probably just comes from British dialect. So there was a term wow, to grumble or complain. And that's the most likely explanation because many Australian English terms actually have the origin in British dialect. So, words that might have been quite regional in Britain but come out with settlers and then get retained in Australian English or evolve in Australian English. But one of the popular stories of its origin is it comes from the "We only want social evils rectified or righted," which was a headline used by John Norton, who was the editor of the Truth newspaper, which really disliked the wowsers. So
he
was always condemning them. And
it was more in favour of the larrikins, was it?
So they were kind of targeted in the newspaper, and he very much popularised the term wowser, or perhaps even in some way kind of helped to evolve it from wow to wowser. I mean, it's a word that's been retained, perhaps not not with quite the same meaning perhaps, but we still kind of condemn the wowsers and celebrate the larrikins.
Yeah. No, the wowser is still pretty much a negative term. You don't really want to be described as a wowser, whereas we're okay with being described as a larrikin to an extent. So picking up on the wowsers were invariably women, given their links to the temperance movement. The language, Australian English, how it developed through the colonial period, the 18th, 19th centuries into the early 20th century, you do see it's a very male-dominated language, although there would have been many female words, but perhaps didn't rise to the prominence of the male origin words. But of course, the word Sheila, which is used to this day, I don't know if I'd want to be called a Sheila, but, it is used to this day. It became a general term for any woman, but it didn't originate as such, did it, Amanda?
Well, Sheila, we think, probably comes from the Irish proper name Sheila in the 1820s and, became a word that was used to describe women. But I think it's one of those words that's really interesting because it is, like you say, you're not sure whether you'd want to be described as a Sheila. It's when we sort of have a bit of a, especially women, maybe not men, they probably don't think about it, but women, when we do think about it, would say we have quite an ambivalent relationship to it because there is a sense that it's not stereotyping, but kind of dismissing all women as this one group rather than kind of seeing the nuances of
the individual.
The individual, that's right.
Yeah.
What I thought was really interesting about Sheila is that it seems to be being revived a bit at the moment. So there's something called the Sheila Shakedown, which you may not have heard of, but I only recently came across this, which is essentially, it's partly fundraising, but it's basically women on motorbikes who are going to go out and camp out. And I think they raise money. It's called the Sheila Shakedown. You can join it if you ride a motorbike. And I thought it was quite interesting. And I have seen a little bit of talk about it being revived with some of the younger generations as well. Probably ironically, I'm guessing for, TikTok videos and things like that, where some of that really traditional Australian slang is being revived, but used in quite a ironic or performative kind of way. But I think your point about the sort of broader story of Australian English being very masculine, I think is spot on. And I think it's very much part of how we see, if we think about the kind of archetypes of Australian culture and the ones who use the Australian slang, Australian English, the larrikin, the digger, the bushman, the ocker, the bogan, we tend to think of them as male. So I've actually, with myself and a colleague, we are working on a project at the moment, which is about women and their relationship to slang and colloquial language in Australia. So watch this space. We will have more interesting things to say about the role of women and their relationship to Australian slang and informal language. So that's been really exciting to work on.
Much less so, of course, in the 21st century, but in the 19th century and most of the the 20th, I guess. Australia's economy was an agricultural economy. We rode on the sheep's back. We had a vision of a quintessential Australian landscape was a rural landscape. So the idea of the bush and the word bush is really important when it comes to the development of Australian English, isn't it?
Yeah, I do think it's quite fascinating how, certainly in the 19th century, the agricultural economy was really important. And I'm not sure, I can't quite remember the exact point at which that starts to change, but I think it's quite early around the turn of the century that you see the sort of urban economy becoming more important, or at least certainly becoming as important. But that bush mythology, bush culture, bush legend has been so important in Australia. And what's fascinating, if you look at the Australian National Dictionary and you look at our entry for bush, so we basically, the way our dictionary works is bush would be our head word, and we would have all the different senses of bush and all the compounds with bush, like
bush ranger, bushland,
it's bush dance, bush races, whatever. It's like the longest entry in the dictionary. We have just produced so much language around the bush. And that's just talking about bush itself as opposed to all the words that kind of adhere around it. And it's fascinating how that's become so, from the 19th century, of course, but even today we're still seeing new bush compounds coming into the language. So we still have this fascination with the bush. It's still a really important source of our identity and our culture, I think, certainly for a lot of people. And it's certainly still having an influence on our language. So I think...
But the word isn't even English. It comes from South Africa.
Well, that's right.
Dutch bosh, woodland.
Yes, but I think South African English is about the only other variety of English that has a quite strong attachment to the word bush in a kind of way of talking about their environment, but nowhere near what we do. And so it is kind of fascinating how we've used that particular term to describe our landscape and sort of stuck with it. Like, it hasn't really changed. It was there right at the very beginning of European settlement, and we've stuck with that largely as the descriptor we use. We still say we're going out bush. So
yeah. And I think the word bush, to me as an Australian, it is an Australian landscape that springs to mind. So if someone said the word countryside, say they came from the UK to Australia and they said, oh, the countryside, you just think it was a European landscape. It's very green, a lot of deciduous trees, a lot of sort of blue greens, as opposed to that sort of grey green you get in the Australian landscape. So it just doesn't even work, countryside in Australia, does it?
Yeah, that's right. And it is that kind of contrast as well. If you think about the sort of language even around the bush, some of it's very positive, but there's also some of it that's quite negative in a way that we don't necessarily would say the same thing of, say, the English countryside and the green rolling hills. We don't kind of have that. It's almost a landscape that we both embrace, but we're also kind of wary of. Certainly if you come from the cities, we'd be pretty wary of the bush.
Yeah, there's a kind of an inhospitable overlay of the bush, is it, in terms of the drought or the floods, but also the creatures. There are a lot of creatures in the bush. One of the words that is, if you ask someone, what are Australian values? Just tell me, give me 3 words. People say mateship. They say egalitarianism as well, but mateship often comes to mind. Where did this word mateship come from, Amanda?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. Another one, if you sort of pick out the words that kind of tell you something about the Australian psyche, I think mateship is one of those words. The term mate itself is, of course, not specifically Australian, and even the sense of mate as in friend is not necessarily Australian. But so many meanings have kind of adhered to the idea of mate across time. So the very earliest sense that we see emerge in the 19th century of mate was really around almost a kind of business transaction to be an equal partner in an enterprise. You would go mates with someone. But by the end of the 19th century, and then very much in the early 20th century, it was this idea of a sworn friend. So in the bush, in the trenches of World War I, you kind of forged this sense of who your mates were and a sense of mateship. And we've seen it evolve since then. And a lot of the terms around egalitarianism also start to emerge in this period as well, and is kind of part of our identity and the way in which we like to see ourselves. Some of us sometimes fall short of some of these ideals, but certainly the way we would like to see ourselves. And then from the middle of the 20th century, you start to see, I think, more nuanced uses of mate. There's the more ironic, what I might call kind of passive-aggressive use of mate, where you might be using it as a slight threat. That, you know, if somebody's not really your mate, you're actually more likely to be being a little bit threatening towards them. But it's really interesting. I mean, you still see mateship being really highly valued. Myself and some colleagues did a survey of some people's attitudes towards this. And what we concluded, or what we got out of that survey, was really that people are very wary when people use the term mateship cynically. So I think they didn't like politicians of any stripe invoking mateship in any kind of false way. But when you talked about being out there in the bush, you know, there's a bushfire, there's a flood, mateship's really important. It's about sort of supporting your community and being there for other people in your community. And so I still think it has a lot of value, but people don't like it being used in that kind of cynical way.
There's a funny quote from Bill Hayden, who was a leader of the Labor Party in the early 80s. And when he found out he was about to be removed as leader and replaced by Bob Hawke, he said, when they call you mate in the New South Wales Labor Party, it's like getting a kiss from the mafia.
Yeah.
So not a great mate then.
I think that very much captures that kind of ironic, you know, yeah. Watch out for your mates, kind of.
Yeah. With mates like these, who needs enemies? So some other quintessentially Australian words. I think that, you know, your mate would say, were they a fair dinkum mate? And, you know, did your mate give you a fair go? These sort of terms, I mean, I think today would be used sort of somewhat tongue-in-cheek. They seem a little bit old-fashioned, although we had a prime minister a few prime ministers ago who brought fair suck of the sauce bottle back into the everyday lexicon, again probably with a fair degree of derision directed at him because it wasn't in common parlance. But tell me about these terms, fair dinkum and fair go. How are they related and where did they come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating that we see, like I was saying with mateship, a kind of growth in these terms around egalitarianism from the late 19th century and through into the early 20th century. And word like dinkum, fair dinkum, dinky die, very much got a lot of traction during the First World War. So that idea of sort of something being genuine was very much a kind of value that was important around that period of time. Then we also see fair go, and actually fair go actually has a really interesting story because the early uses of fair go in the 19th century seem to be more around a sporting term. So you're going to give someone a fair go. It's kind of like a spirited challenge to something. It wasn't necessarily specifically linked to an idea of egalitarianism. But through the early 20th century and in the sort of post-World War II period as well, you saw a real adherence to this idea of the fair go. And I think 1940 is when we first see Australia being called the land of the fair go. So it was this idea that you had a kind of opportunity, you had an equal opportunity in Australia. So I think there's a really interesting sort of development of that idea of egalitarianism and what fairness means through that early the first few decades of the 20th century that I think is really interesting. And fair go in particular, I think, yeah, you're right, but dinkum is maybe something that feels a bit old-fashioned or you might use a bit ironically or a bit self-consciously. But I think the fair go still has quite a lot of traction. I think certainly politicians still like to talk about it.
Oh, yes, of course.
While, you know, the majority of us might acknowledge that the fair go is in fact not something that everybody benefits from. You know, we don't all get a fair go, but such is the way.
It's the aspiration.
It's the aspiration.
And I think Australia's, one of its great characteristics is its yearn to improve and aspiration to give people a fair go and that, you know, your better days are ahead of you. Interestingly, in 1952, Dame Enid Lyons, who was a minister in the Menzies government and had been the wife of the former Prime Minister Joseph Lyons, she had great affection for the term fair go and she thought it was so important that it could be incorporated in the National Coat of Arms.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I mean, I have great admiration for Enid Lyons. I think she's a fascinating person. And yeah, like she was very fond of the term. She was quite fond of Australian slang generally. She wrote about it a bit because she had a column in the newspaper that she also wrote, and she talked about slang every now and again there. But yeah, fair go was her favourite expression of the Australian expressions that she liked. And I think it's a sort of sign that in that period, in the post-World War II period, that this idea of the fair go had, a great deal of traction, that this was about the opportunity, like everybody had this opportunity to do well in Australia. There was a perception that everybody had this opportunity to do well in Australia.
Now, Amanda, it would be remiss of me to neglect to ask you what were the words that were drawn from the Menzies era that you featured in your book, Australia in 100 Words.
Yeah, well, the sort of post-World War II period through to the 1960s is a fascinating time in Australia, of course. Many new migrants to Australia, the sort of growth of suburban Australia, the kind of suburban ethos, which is really important as well to Australia. We've talked about the bush, but of course, having your own home and your own backyard with a hills hoist, of course, the Great Australian Dream. So we see terms like the Great Australian Dream, the Australian way of life, becoming really important in that period and very much products of that post-war period where there was, for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, a great deal of opportunity. Home ownership increased enormously through that period. Consumer goods, a kind of consumer lifestyle as well here in Australia. And so we see words like esky and stubby and words like that come into Australian English as well, some of them from proprietary names like esky. There were also critics in that period as well, of course, the lucky country term, which was initially meant to be a kind of dig at Australia.
Yes, ironic, yeah.
Because we were...
That nuance has definitely been lost, though. I think most people would see it as a positive that we are the lucky country.
That's
they wouldn't
right.
realise that Donald Horne was paying out on us.
Yeah, those nuances I think were lost pretty early. So there were critics as well, but I think a lot of the language through that time very much captured that sense of opportunity. And of course, Menzies came in, appealing to the forgotten Australian. So that's the other term that I think, one of those political terms that's had a lot of life and traction in our way of thinking about Australia and its politics.
A phrase that I always thought it was British, actually, a cup of tea, a Bex and a good lie down as a sort of solution to a woman's hysteria or coming overwhelmed with womanly duties, I guess is relating to that rise of suburban life and the expectations of women to keep the perfect home for their husband and their families, and that there was a social status attached to that, but also a lot of pressures attached to it as well.
Yeah, it's a phrase that really has a dark side, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think they later proved that the Bex, which was like a sort of sleeping draft, I think, led to kidney collapse, kidney disease or something horrible like that because of the nature of it. But yeah, part of that kind of consumer life, I suppose, sort of became out of advertising. I think a cup of tea and a Bex and a good lie down. And there was also a play that was done that used the term as its title, and it was a bit of a dig at sort of suburban Australia. But yeah, it's one of those, there's not a lot, I think, that hints the dark side of that period, but that's one of those phrases that perhaps kind of captures a little bit more of the underside, the not so nice things. Especially for women who had less economic opportunity at that time.
A word that has come about in my lifetime, really in the last, I think, 10, 15 years, is democracy sausage. And we always sort of had sausages and cakes, I guess, cake stalls at polling booths growing up, but we didn't articulate them as a phenomenon. We didn't recognise that that was something that we had that other countries might not have. It's a recent addition to Australia's dictionary, National Dictionary. But tell me, how did it come about, this democracy sausage?
Yeah, well, we've traced the democracy sausage, the term, to 2010. Obviously, the thing itself pre-exists that. And probably comes from, it did come from, our first evidence came from a website that was created, I think it was just called democracysausage.com, which allowed you to find the places that had the best sausages. So you could kind of say, okay, well, I'll go to this polling booth as opposed to that polling booth, and I'll be able to get this sausage, or this one doesn't have any sausages at all, so I won't go there. What I particularly like, I think, about that term is the way in which it really captures that process of being involved in democracy. Yes, we're all required to vote, but we all enjoy going out it's one of the benefits of going out and voting. You might not like who you're voting for, but you might know your choices, but you can at least get a sausage or a cake or whatever your preference might be when you're at the polling booth. So I think it does speak to that kind of democratic process, and long may it exist for us in a world where we can't really take these things for granted.
I guess it's linked to the ideas of Australian democracy. We have compulsory voting, so you have to go. So, well, at least you get some benefit from going because you get a sausage. And it's very accessible food too. It's really, really cheap. Almost anyone can afford $2 to buy a sausage. And it's interesting that with the rise of pre-poll voting, people are concerned that the charities, which it also represents, because it's generally charities who are running the sausage sizzles, which more Australian terms there, that they aren't actually getting the custom through their sausage sizzle stands because people have already voted at pre-poll votes in vast numbers.
No, okay. I didn't know that had become a concern, but it makes sense.
It's a concern, yes.
So I don't know how we're going to address that. So that's the problem.
Yeah, might need 3 weeks of democracy sausages just rather than one day. Amanda, fabulous book, great project. You can learn not just about Australian words, but about Australian history. So 2 fabulous endeavours all wrapped up into one book. So thank you very much for joining me on Afternoon Light again.
Great. Thank you so much, Georgina.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.